Despite all of DC Comics' struggles over the past 12 months or so, there's been one thing they could always count on as far as the best-selling ongoing series in the entire industry, at least in North America. It was going to be Batman. That changed in January of 2023. This hasn't really happened since the end of Tom King's run, and people really started abandoning ship. We're going to talk all about that and 5 other very interesting trends that I want to talk about that I found when looking at the January 2023 comic sales data. This is admittedly imperfect information. The information that we're looking at today is actually derived from the Comic Hub app, which is used by less than 200 stores worldwide. But these are actual sales to customers, and while they aren't hard, fast sales numbers, they do give us a general understanding of what's popular, what's selling for the major brands as far as DC, Marvel, and the indie publishers as well. In lieu of better information, this is what we have to work with. And trust me, as an intelligence analyst for 15 years in the United States military, you can definitely gain some very good information on this. Once again, a tip of the cap to the guys at Comic Book Revolution, specifically Rock. He has his own analysis in the article, and I do suggest you go check it out and come up with your own insights as far as comic book sales and what you find is interesting. Throw it in the comment section, and let's start a conversation about comic sales in January 2023. First up, we need to talk about the new #1 selling ongoing series in all of comic books. Not surprisingly, it's Amazing Spider-Man number 17, outselling Batman number 131. What's interesting about this, because these are actually sales to customers, if a comic book ships like the last week of the month, the sales ranking can actually be skewed because there are more sales going on that series at the beginning of the next month. But Batman 131 actually came out on January 3rd. So this is a true representation, at least at those stores, that Amazing Spider-Man is now outselling Batman 131. We've seen indications over the past several months that Batman fatigue is indeed setting in. Detective Comics is about to drop out of the top 50. We don't ever see that. That's a perennial top 25 seller. And a lot of Batman-related stories just aren't even making the top 100. Pretty crazy considering that's the cash cow for DC Comics and the only thing that's really keeping them above water. And I believe they have flooded the market to such a degree that people just can't keep up with their Batman collections, even if you wanted to be a Batman completionist. It is so expensive, over $100 a month, just to buy every Batman-related series coming out from DC Comics. I think that's why a lot of people have decided to step away. Also, beginning with that issue, Jorge Jimenez is no longer the Batman artist, at least temporarily. I believe he's coming back, and Mike Hawthorne has stepped in. Jorge Jimenez is probably the best artist in mainstream comic books today. I think that probably affected that as well. This does not mean that Batman is no longer going to be the best-selling series moving forward. This could be an aberration, but it's something worth keeping an eye on. Another thing that I thought was really interesting from Marvel Comics is they had 2 new series debut very high, both in the top 10. Scarlet Witch #1 from Steve Orlando at number 3, Sins of Sinister #1 at number 8 from Kieran Gillen. I would have never in my life expected a #1 series from Steve Orlando to outsell a Kieran Gillen #1. I think Marvel Comics made an enormous mistake going from Axe Judgment Day almost immediately into Sins of Sinister, 2 X-Men events essentially written by the same author, and Axe Judgment Day absolutely sucked, and the sales weren't good. By the end, people were jumping ship, and I think that might have killed off the enthusiasm for Sins of Sinister #1, which I personally thought was a really good comic book. Way better than anything Kieran Gillen has done during his return to Marvel Comics so far. Scarlet Witch #1 is a bit more of a divisive comic book. I've heard a lot of people say it's Steve Orlando per usual, just really bad writing. He's been so terrible at Marvel Comics, it's not even funny. I imagine the only way this actually happened is 1, there were overships, which I think probably could have happened, although Marvel were doing those less than they had been previously when we actually did have the data, or there are just a lot of really good variant covers with really good artists to prop up the sales. I don't see a Steve Orlando ongoing or miniseries sitting inside the top 10 or even top 25 or really even the top 50. Maybe issue #2 makes the top 50 before it falls out completely, but he's just such a bad writer. And Scarlet Witch, while certainly an interesting character, and certainly she has been more prevalent in the movies and stuff, and there's more awareness of the character today than there ever has been, isn't exactly a big name star within Marvel Comics. I don't think she can carry her own ongoing series in comic books today, and I think Marvel agrees that's why it's a mini-series, but for at least for 1 month, it outsold Sinister Sinister #1, an event comic, But really, it's a bigger indictment, I think, on Sins of Sinister, Marvel Comics, Jordan White, the X-Men line. I just don't think there was a lot of excitement for this. Just back to back to back to back, X-Men related events. We had X Judgment Day. Dark Web is still going on. Sins of Sinister kicks off. We still got Fall of X and the Hellfire Gala and the X-Men vote. Like, the X-Men office is leaning far too heavily on the event gimmick to make up the sales. And it looks to me, just from my eyes, although we do need a little bit more data, people are catching on and they're not really interested in all the events going on at Marvel Comics and DC Comics for that matter. We're going to talk about Lazarus Planet here in a minute. Is the outbreak among Marvel and DC Comics of just random #1 issues, even though they're supposed to be tied together. Brian Hibbs, in his latest Tilting at Windmills newsletter, pointed out that this was a major problem for Marvel and DC Comics, where they basically come up with an idea, but they don't want to call it a miniseries. They want as many #1 issues as possible, so they just release a bunch of random #1s that are supposed to be tied together. We see this, of course, with Lazarus Planet, all in theory related, but really you get a #1 alpha issue, you're going to get an omega issue, and then a bunch of short stories and anthologies in the middle that really tie together with nothing. I don't think this is a very good strategy for events moving forward, and you can see here it's playing out before our very eyes. These #1s aren't really debuting all that high. Only 2 of them made the top 25. This Batman One Bad Day series, these are supposed to be like new classic influential stories about the biggest villains in Batman's rogues gallery. And people have kind of checked out. Yes, a few issues are doing okay, and Batman One Bad Day Bane #1 coming in at number 14, I guess, is pretty good. This is supposed to be tying into classic Alan Moore type stuff, and it's not really working all that well. And obviously the biggest example, the biggest loser in all of this is Murder World Wolverine #1. I think this is supposed to be like a story that ties together revolving around Arcade and Murder World throughout the Marvel Comics universe, but they just keep giving it like a stupid subtitle in a #1 issue. But if you miss one issue, you don't even know because it's all titled completely differently. And this clear sales gimmick designed to get out as many #1 issues as possible, I think is also wearing thin on people. They're kind of figuring out it's just kind of stupid. DC and Marvel are going back to this way too often, where you get a #1 issue for the Alpha, a #1 issue from the Omega, and then the stuff in between, you don't even know what the actual story is. Where does it begin and where does it end? And what's the filler stuff that I don't need to read? And I think a lot of people are figuring out it's all the filler stuff you don't need to read. One thing that's been very interesting, seeing the decline of DC Comics sales, they vacated a lot of spots in the top 100, and most of them have been filled not by Marvel, but by independent comics. I think there are like 4 Spawn titles in the top 100. That's amazing. An indie title holding up 4% of the entire top 100 selling comic books in North America. But we're also seeing multiple titles related to James Tynion's Something is Killing the Children, basically staying in the top 50 for long periods of time. Saga's also out there. There's one long-standing, beloved comic book franchise that's an indie series that's not even in the top 100, although it has 3 titles related to it in the top 100. And it just really shows you just how stupid IDW are with their handling of the TMNT ongoing series. I understand they wanted to give Sophie Campbell a chance. Sophie Campbell is a very good artist, but is a terrible comic book writer, and has basically put the Turtles to the side so that Jennica can come to the forefront and use Mutant Town as this weird trans allegory within the TMNT universe. And we've been stuck there for fucking 3 years now. And the fans have spoken. They don't like this version of TMNT. They don't like this direction. We see TMNT, The Last Ronin, Lost Years #1, a top 10 comic book. Not surprising, considering the success of The Last Ronin. That is associated with something very, very popular in comic books, but also in the top 50, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers TMNT Volume 2 #1, which actually debuted in December, not January. It actually debuted, I believe, on December 28th. It's sitting inside the top 50. Inside the top 100, we have the second issue, which came out at the very end of the month. It was likely a much better selling comic book than its 88 ranking would indicate, because a lot of sales actually came out in February as well, because it came out at the end of the month. If IDW would pull their heads out of their asses and actually go out and find a decent comic book writer that wanted to tell TMNT stories, it would be a perennial top 50, top 25 selling type comic book. There's a lot of interest in the Turtles, but there's no interest in Jennica. And for some reason, IDW, despite bankruptcy staring them dead in the eye, will not change course and remove Sophie Campbell from that series as the writer. Just an enormous folly, and one of the reasons IDW is going out of business. You wanted proof that they were dumbasses? Number one, they hired Heather Antos. Number two, they won't get rid of Sophie Campbell on TMNT. The last trend that I thought was interesting are the sales on Lazarus Planet. Lazarus Planet Alpha #1 from Mark Waid is absolutely phenomenal. It's a very, very good comic book. I reviewed it here with Jim. We both liked it a lot, but we both said we don't know where this is going because Mark Waid isn't writing any more of it until the Omega issue, and it's a bunch of anthology stories from people you've never heard of. Now that we know the truth about DC Comics and the way that they're managing their events, where Mark Waid is the showrunner on here, and he's getting a portion of the page rates for the people creating these comic books, I'm not surprised they can only get a few competent writers associated with it. Now, Rock from Comic Book Revolution was much more impressed with these sales than I am. I say, yes, Lazarus Planet Alpha being a top 15 comic book is okay. That is not bad. But it is a DC Comics event, and it is kicking off Dawn of DCU, the big reboot for the franchise moving into 2023. This does not look good. This should be a top 5, top 10 selling comic book. But then when you see the other two just massive drop-offs, Lazarus Planet, Assault on Krypton #1, barely makes it inside the top 50. And then Lazarus Planet, We Once Were Gods #1, sitting in there at number 79. I'll be honest, this does not look good for DC Comics in their reboot in 2023. People need to be convinced DC fans aren't just going to come back for the next reboot. They need to know that things are good. And I don't think this Lazarus Planet kicking off Dawn of DCU was a good idea to begin with. Having it be a bunch of anthology stories and then slow rolling all the series out. We don't even know what series are going to debut with all the writers yet. I don't think this was a good strategy. I don't think they had a firm plan to begin with. And I think they're pulling this one directly out of their asses. And you can see right there, judging by the amount of interest in comics sold, at least through Comics Hub related comic book shops, they've got a lot of work to do to turn people around on anything other than Batman within DC Comics. And Batman is not even the #1 selling comic book in the industry anymore. That is an enormous problem. Now, Nightwing, with its 100th issue, did jump inside the top 5, and that was a good side. We'll see if it stays there. I doubt it. You know, it was a milestone issue. Everyone likes Nightwing, so they got a nice bump there, but there's a lot of bad news for DC Comics. Worst is this new idea of how they're going to screw over writers when it comes to event books. They want events to be special. They want people to pay premium dollars for events, and they want them to buy in, but they're not really treating the creators special. I went over this. I was flabbergasted when I found out how DC Comics were treating the writers. If you haven't seen this, definitely check it out right here. There's also a link in the video description.